The moment the headline broke, the internet froze, then exploded. 50 Cent strikes back, not with a diss track, not with an interview, but with something far more dangerous. A Netflix documentary that didn't just reopen old wounds, it ripped them wide open. The reckoning wasn't supposed to be a weapon, but overnight it became one, and the Diddy case was suddenly spiraling into chaos. People thought this story was finished. They thought the damage
We're
was already
losing.
done. But when 50 Cent's fingerprints resurfaced all over the reckoning, the tone shifted instantly. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't passive. This felt intentional, calculated, like a final move in a long game nobody realized was still being played. Within hours of the documentary trending, legal analysts, journalists, and former insiders all started saying the same thing. This changes everything. Clips began circulating at lightning speed, unseen footage, raw call recordings, survivor interviews that felt too consistent to ignore. Social media didn't treat it like entertainment. It treated it like evidence. Timelines were built, old rumors were re-examined. Statements from years ago suddenly made sense. And the louder the public reaction grew, the clearer it became that this documentary wasn't just exposing the past. It was actively destabilizing the present. Before going any deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you stay ahead of breaking updates like this while this story is still unfolding. Now let's get back to what really matters. Because what happened next is where things got dangerous. TV panels abandoned their usual scripts and went into full debate mode. Podcasts dropped emergency episodes. TikTok lawyers paused frames, analyzed timestamps, and matched voices. Reddit threads turned into live investigations. And through all of it, one question kept surfacing louder than the rest. Did 50 Cent just force the justice system to move? This wasn't a random Netflix drop anymore. It felt like a pressure bomb. Every new clip added heat. Every interview added weight. Every reaction made it harder for the court to pretend nothing had changed. The Diddy case, once considered controlled, contained, and predictable, was suddenly unstable. Insiders started whispering that prosecutors were rewatching the documentary, that clerks were pulling files, that phones inside the courthouse weren't quiet anymore. And when that happens, it usually means one thing: the system is being pushed to respond. What makes this moment so explosive isn't just the content of the reckoning, it's the timing, the intent, the way it landed right when public patience ran out. This wasn't closure, this was escalation. And as the pressure kept building, one reality became impossible to ignore. This documentary didn't just reopen conversations, it shoved the Diddy case straight into chaos. And the fallout was only beginning. The deeper people went into the reckoning, the clearer it became that this wasn't just case. It was exposure layered with intent. Episode after episode peeled back stories that were never meant to be connected publicly. Hidden clips resurfaced. Private calls echoed again. Interviews from people who had vanished from the industry suddenly made sense. This wasn't random storytelling. It felt assembled, precise, and relentless. Viewers noticed something unsettling almost immediately. The patterns. Different years, different cities, different people. Yet the same descriptions of control, fear, and silence repeated again and again. The documentary didn't need to scream in accusations. It let the consistency do the damage. One clip would end, and another would begin somewhere else in the timeline. Yet the language, the behavior, the emotional aftermath all lined up like pieces of a puzzle finally snapping into place. Then came the recordings. Not dramatized, not reenacted. Real voices, hesitation, breathing, tension, moments where words stopped because fear took over. People watching at home described feeling like they were listening to something they weren't supposed to hear. And once those clips hit social media, there was no pulling them back. They spread faster than any PR team could contain. What made things spiral even faster was how quickly the internet turned investigative. Old interviews were dug up. Lyrics were re-examined. Statements that once sounded vague suddenly felt like warnings hiding in plain sight. Comment sections stopped being emotional and started being analytical. Screenshots, timelines, comparisons. The public wasn't just reacting anymore. They were building a case in real time. And then the media followed. Major networks stopped asking if the documentary mattered and started asking how much damage it could do. Legal experts openly questioned whether material shown in The Reckoning could be ignored by prosecutors. Former investigators appeared on panels saying they had never seen public pressure build this fast around a reopened narrative. That's when the tone shifted from scandal to instability. Behind the scenes, whispers began leaking out. Prosecutors were reportedly reviewing segments. Clerks were requesting access to related filings. Defense teams across the industry were watching closely because everyone understood what this meant. When public evidence starts lining up with sealed records, the ground beneath a case begins to crack. Diddy's silence suddenly became louder than any statement he could have released. No denials, no counters, no controlled messaging, just absence. And in moments like this, absence doesn't look neutral, it looks vulnerable. What started as a Netflix release had now become something far more dangerous. A catalyst, the kind that forces systems to move, narratives to shift, and cases to re-enter territory nobody expected. And as the pressure kept building, one thing became obvious to everyone watching closely. This wasn't the peak of the chaos, it was the setup. Because once evidence meets momentum, the next move is never made by the internet. It's made by the court. While the public was dissecting every frame of The Reckoning, something far more serious was happening quietly, away from cameras and comment sections. Cassie Ventura's legal team was watching the same clips, but they weren't reacting like fans or commentators. They were reacting like lawyers who suddenly realized the ground beneath an old case was shifting. What caught their attention wasn't just how disturbing the documentary was, it was how familiar it felt. Scenes from the film lined up with sealed statements they had filed years ago. Descriptions that were once dismissed as uncorroborated now appeared on screen, echoed by different voices, different faces, different timelines, yet telling the same story. A hallway clip here, a phone call there, a survivor describing fear using almost the exact language Cassie had used in private depositions. That kind of overlap isn't coincidence. In court, it's called pattern. The team began pulling old files, notes from interviews, time-stamped messages, records that never fully made it into public proceedings. As they compared them with the documentary, the room grew quiet. Not because they were shocked, but because they understood the implications. The documentary had unintentionally done what years of litigation couldn't. It brought fragmented evidence together in a way that was suddenly impossible to ignore. One attorney reportedly paused the screen and said, "This fills the gaps." That's when the strategy changed. Instead of reacting publicly, Cassie's team moved fast and deliberately. They compiled references from the documentary, not as entertainment, but as leads. They matched scenes with existing records. They flagged overlaps. They identified moments that could justify renewed scrutiny. And most importantly, they asked the question every legal team asks when momentum shifts like this. What does the court do when new material reframes the entire case? Because the issue was no longer whether the documentary was biased, exaggerated, or controversial. The issue was whether it revealed information that materially altered the understanding of conduct already under review. And that's a legal threshold, but not a social one. At the same time, legal analysts on television began echoing the same concern. If this footage aligns with previously submitted testimony, one expert said, it becomes relevant whether or not it came from Netflix. Another added, courts don't respond to documentaries, but they do respond to corroboration. Behind the scenes, word started circulating that formal submissions were being prepared, that prosecutors were being alerted, that the documentary wasn't being treated as evidence itself, but as a trigger pointing toward evidence that already existed. And that's when the mood around the Diddy case changed again, because once lawyers stop asking what people think and start asking what the judge must consider, the chaos stops being cultural and starts becoming legal. And somewhere inside the system, doors that were once closed were quietly beginning to open again. By the time the legal conversations began shifting behind closed doors, the media had already lost control of the story. This wasn't a slow burn anymore. It was a full-scale eruption. Every network wanted answers. Every panel wanted a verdict, and every commentator seemed to agree on one thing. The reckoning had pushed the Diddy case into territory no one was prepared for. Morning shows stopped treating it like entertainment news. Anchors leaned forward, voices lowered, using words usually reserved for criminal investigations. Pattern, corroboration, systemic behavior. Late-night hosts abandoned jokes entirely. Podcasts that normally dissect pop culture turned into legal roundtables overnight. And social media, it wasn't reacting anymore. It was prosecuting. Clips from the documentary looped endlessly. People slowed them down, enhanced audio, compared dates. Someone would post a short video, and within minutes, thousands of comments would appear underneath, connecting it to something from years ago. Old interviews resurfaced where people had hinted at fear but never explained why. Lyrics were re-examined. Statements that once sounded vague suddenly felt like warnings hidden in plain sight. And the most dangerous part for Diddy wasn't the outrage. It was the consensus. Strangers who had never spoken to each other were arriving at the same conclusions. Different platforms, different audiences, same reaction. That kind of alignment doesn't happen often, and when it does, institutions start paying attention. Outside the courthouse, reporters began gathering earlier than usual, not because a hearing was scheduled, but because they sensed movement. Legal correspondents whispered that prosecutors were being asked questions they hadn't heard before. Questions like, did you review this? Does this line up with prior statements? Why wasn't this included earlier? Inside newsrooms, producers instructed teams to prepare breaking news packages, just in case. The phrase case instability started showing up in internal emails. Analysts began saying the quiet part out loud. When public evidence starts mirroring sealed records, silence becomes impossible. And Diddy's side? Still nothing. No interviews, no statements, no counter-narrative. The absence wasn't strategic anymore. It felt like paralysis. Every hour without a response allowed the story to grow its own legs, and it was running in directions no PR team could chase. By now, the question had changed. It was no longer, did the documentary go too far? It was, did it go far enough? Because once the media starts framing a story around accountability instead of controversy, the pressure doesn't fade. It escalates. And somewhere between the headlines, the hashtags, and the hushed courthouse conversations, a realization settled in. This case wasn't just back in the spotlight, it was being pulled back into motion. And when momentum shifts like this, there's always a moment when the system has to respond. Not because it wants to, but because it no longer has a choice. As the noise outside grew louder, the real tension moved inward, into conference rooms, phone calls, and late-night discussions that never make headlines. This was the stage where cases either stabilize or start slipping out of control. And for the first time in a long time, the Diddy case felt unstable. Inside legal circles, the tone had changed completely. What once sounded like online outrage was now being discussed in careful, deliberate language. Prosecutors weren't reacting to tweets. They were reviewing overlap. Overlap between what the documentary showed and what already existed in sealed filings, prior interviews, and archived materials. That overlap is dangerous because it doesn't require new accusations. It reframes old ones. People close to the situation began whispering that internal reviews were underway. Not public, not announced, quiet, methodical. The kind of reviews that happen when no one wants to be caught unprepared if a judge asks the wrong question at the wrong time. And that's when the pressure reached Diddy's defense team. Emergency meetings were called. Advisors who normally focused on image control suddenly had nothing to work with. There was no clean angle, no simple denial, no way to discredit a narrative that wasn't coming from one source, but from dozens, all pointing in the same direction. Silence stopped being strategic and started looking like a crack. Insiders leaked that conversations behind closed doors were tense, that the defense wasn't arguing about public perception anymore. They were arguing about exposure, about what could be revisited, about what might resurface if the court decided to look again. Because once a case re-enters review territory, control disappears fast. At the same time, Cassie's legal team didn't speak publicly, and that silence mattered. It wasn't defensive. It was confident. The kind of silence that suggests preparation, not panic. People watching closely noticed it immediately. When one side goes quiet and the other side tightens up, something is shifting. Even journalists began reporting differently. The language softened, then sharpened. Developing situation. Legal implications. Court response possible. Those phrases don't appear unless editors believe something is actually moving behind the scenes. And then came the moment that sent a chill through everyone paying attention. Court sources hinted that materials tied to the reckoning were being requested, not dismissed. That doesn't mean acceptance, but it does mean consideration. And consideration is the doorway to action. The Diddy case had entered a dangerous phase, the one where no one can predict the next move. But everyone knows the stakes just doubled. The chaos wasn't loud anymore. It was quiet, focused, procedural. And in the legal world, that's when things get real. Because once pressure turns into process, the internet stops leading the story. And the system starts catching up. By this point, the chaos had stopped looking explosive and started looking procedural. That's when things become truly dangerous. Because explosions burn out. Procedures don't. Procedures move quietly, deliberately, and once they start, they don't stop just because the noise outside fades. Inside the system, the documentary was no longer being discussed as media. It was being discussed as a roadmap. Not proof by itself, but a guide pointing directly toward things that already existed. Old files, old statements, old inconsistencies. The kind of material that, once re-examined under a new lens, can completely change how a case is understood. People close to the process began noticing subtle shifts. Calls that used to go unanswered were suddenly returned. Requests that once stalled were now acknowledged. Language changed. Instead of previously resolved, insiders heard phrases like context review and scope reassessment. Those words don't mean chaos is ending. They mean it's entering a controlled phase. For Diddy's defense, this was the worst possible development. You can fight public opinion, you can challenge media narratives, but you cannot argue with a system once it decides to look again. Behind closed doors, the defense team reportedly began preparing for multiple scenarios, not because they knew what was coming, but because they no longer did. When uncertainty replaces confidence, power starts to slip. Advisors warned that any aggressive response could backfire. Silence felt safer, but silence also allowed others to move without resistance. Meanwhile, prosecutors were no longer dismissing questions as hypothetical. They were being asked how certain things aligned, not if they mattered. That distinction is everything. Because once alignment becomes the focus, the next step is verification. And verification leads straight back into court. Even longtime legal observers began saying the same thing quietly. This feels like the moment right before a case changes direction. The public didn't see filings, they didn't see meetings, they didn't see internal memos, but they felt a shift. Headlines softened, speculation hardened. Analysts stopped guessing and started waiting. Waiting for the move that always comes next when pressure meets process. And that's when the most unsettling realization set in. The documentary didn't need to accuse anyone directly. It didn't need to prove everything. It only needed to force the system to look again. Because once the system looks, it doesn't care about fame, and it doesn't care about history, and it definitely doesn't care about reputation. All it cares about is whether something was missed. And if something was missed, the next phase wouldn't be chaotic. It would be decisive. By the time the system began moving, Diddy's world had already started closing in on itself. What once felt like noise outside his control now felt like pressure inside his walls. This was the stage where confidence evaporates, where even the most powerful people realize they're no longer steering the outcome. Insiders described a noticeable shift in posture. Meetings that used to be loud became quiet. Advisors stopped making bold suggestions and started asking cautious questions. The defense wasn't talking about optics anymore. They were talking about exposure, about what could resurface if the wrong door was opened, about how quickly a situation could turn once momentum entered the courtroom. And momentum was building. Every new review, every internal request, every unanswered question created a vacuum where certainty used to be. Diddy's silence wasn't strength anymore. It was restraint, a holding pattern. The kind you enter when you know reacting could make things worse, but staying still doesn't make you safe either. Behind the scenes, people who once felt untouchable began distancing themselves. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. Familiar names disappeared from contact lists. That's when reality starts to sink in, not through headlines, but through absence. Legal analysts watching closely started using different language. They stopped calling it backlash. They stopped calling it controversy. They started calling it instability. And instability inside a legal framework doesn't fade on its own. It demands resolution. Meanwhile, Cassie's legal team remained focused and silent. No statements, no interviews, no emotional appeals, just preparation. That kind of silence speaks volumes in legal spaces. It signals readiness. It signals patience. And patience, when paired with momentum, is dangerous. By the system, the narrative had fully shifted. The question was no longer whether something would happen, it was how far it could go. When cases reach this point, the next move isn't dramatic. It's formal. It arrives quietly. And once it arrives, everything changes at once. Diddy's team felt it. The media sensed it. And the system was already preparing for it. Because when pressure turns into procedure, there's always a moment, brief, silent, irreversible, when control finally leaves the hands of the people who thought they had it. And that moment was approaching fast, not with a headline, not with a leak, but with a decision that would pull the entire case into its most unpredictable phase yet. The moment finally arrived without warning. Not through a leak, not through eye in a headline, but through a quiet shift that everyone inside the system instantly recognized. What had been whispers turned into motion. What had been review turned into action. And in that instant, the Diddy case crossed a line it could never uncross. Court insiders later described it as the point where everything accelerated at once. Phones rang, files were pulled, calendars were cleared. What had been an abstract possibility suddenly became concrete. An emergency response wasn't being discussed anymore. It was being prepared. The documentary had done what no interview, no lawsuit, no rumor ever managed to do on its own. It forced alignment. Evidence, pressure, and process all collided at the same time. This was the turning point because when prosecutors, clerks, and legal teams move simultaneously without public statements, it means the system has decided something matters enough to act on. The question was no longer if the case was destabilized. The question was how deep the instability ran. Inside Diddy's circle, the realization hit hard. Silence was no longer protective. Time was no longer an ally. The space to maneuver had vanished. Whatever control once existed was gone, replaced by a process that no amount of influence could slow down. Advisors reportedly warned that the fiend had entered a phase where outcomes were no longer negotiable, only survivable. Meanwhile, the media sensed it instantly. Coverage shifted again. Less speculation, more certainty. Analysts stopped theorizing and started using phrases like procedural escalation and judicial response. Those aren't dramatic words. They're dangerous ones because they mean the system is stepping in. And then came the confirmation, an emergency action, a formal move, a clear signal that the documentary had pushed the case past the point of containment. This wasn't chaos caused by outrage anymore. This was chaos caused by consequence. For the first time, the Diddy case was no longer shaped by narratives, defenses, or public perception. It was being shaped by decisions, quiet ones, irreversible ones, made by people whose only job is to act when something has been missed. And in that moment, everything flipped. The documentary stopped being a cultural event. It became a catalyst. 50 Cent didn't need to speak. Netflix didn't need to explain. The system had already responded. This was the point where the story stopped asking questions and started delivering answers, where uncertainty hardened into direction, where the case entered a phase no one could spin, manage, or escape. From here on out, nothing would move slowly, nothing would stay private, and nothing would return to the way it was. This was the instant the Diddy case officially went into chaos. Not because people were talking, but because the system finally decided to act.